Hi, Misha here, and I have another NASA video for you. Actually, this is because Corgi has released or re-released a couple of its small-scale models to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 and the moon landing. This is, of course, the command service module. With, full in-flight setup. But I've talked a good bit in a couple of videos about the Apollo module capsule itself. Of course, it carried a 3-man crew. It was kind of the workhorse of the American space program between Gemini and the Space Shuttle. Not only were these used for the moon missions, but they were used for Skylab and the Soyuz project. Little model is kind of neat. It's pretty much all die-cast metal except for the antenna. Seems to be about 1/44 scale. At least that's according to Akins, where this came from. It's just a kind of a small size, but what I like, it actually scales pretty well with like the Eagle Moss Starship models. It's about that kind of length of that. But I like that it's all metal. And these are very affordable, just about 14-15 bucks. But in this video, I wanted to talk about something that I didn't have a model of before. The Lunar lander, the Lunar module. This is in the same vein, around 1/44 scale, die-cast. And I did not have a model of this before. Even though it's relatively small, it does the job just fine. So I thought we would talk about the history. Initially, this was known as the Lunar Excursion Module, LEM, hence the name LEM. But then, in the summer of 1966, NASA's PR department simplified it to LM, Lunar Module. They felt that excursion was maybe not the right word to be used. That said, the LEM pronunciation remained to the end. And this craft has a very important place in space history. It's really the only true spacecraft that has been flown by man. This was never designed and could not operate in a gravity well like Earth or in an atmosphere like Earth's. It was specifically designed to operate in space and on the moon with its light gravity. And it is a engineering feat. It might seem simple to take off from the Apollo module, which is in lunar orbit, and then land on the moon and come back. It is not at all, especially considering weight is such a factor in space travel. Well, this dates back to 1962, which is when NASA really settled on the orbital insertion, the idea of essentially getting up to Earth orbit and then slinging out of Earth orbit, getting captured by the moon's gravity, going into lunar orbit, and then sending a lander down to the surface. Earlier ideas included basically a direct shot from Earth to the moon and or landing the entire spacecraft on the moon, which would have been a big, heavy, brute force thing. Well, anyway, by that year, around July, since NASA had an idea exactly what it wanted and what the planet was going with, it invited 11 firms to submit proposals and kind of small dossiers on their ideas. And of those, 9 responded. And in November of 62, Grumman was declared the winner. And Grumman was a good choice because it had already kind of been looking at the problem of landing on the moon since the late 50s, and it was one of the early proponents of the orbital style. And of course, it didn't build it alone. No, not at all. There were 4 major subcontractors, including TRW, that we know from the gun world, and Bell, we know for helicopters. And of course, you have all kinds of smaller subcontractors that made engine systems and all kinds of stuff like that. So 62, 63, there were early designs, but really, by 1963, by that summer, they had an idea. Some of the early things they changed. They originally had seats for the 2-man crew that would be on board this. They got rid of those. Originally, they would have large pane, thick, durable windows. They got rid of those because of weight and replaced them with small windows. They also had to play around with the legs. As you see, the version they went with was a 4-leg. Originally, they were going to go with 3 legs, like a tripod. This was for weight savings, but it was very unstable. The moon surface is not smooth. There's lots of boulders and stuff. Then they kind of went the other direction to a 5-leg design that was very sturdy, very stable, but heavy. So the 4-leg was a compromise. It worked. Also, the original mission plan was to have the commander exit onto the lunar surface, leaving the pilot inside to kind of operate as a go-between, the middleman, for communications between the, at that time still LEM, and the guy's suit, and then, of course, that to the CSM in lunar orbit at the time, and then, of course, they would communicate with NASA, so it was kind of a da-da-da. Well, by 1966, there had been enough advancements and assurities and redundancies in communication, they decided that both occupants could leave and go onto the surface, and that the LM, as it was becoming known, would be able to, manually do automatically relay the communications. So, lots of design changes and stuff. This was originally supposed to fly in late 1967 as an unmanned test. Well, that didn't work. There were several delays. It just wasn't ready yet. It did not actually fly as an unmanned test article until Apollo 5 in 1968. And then the next was to be a manned test in Earth orbit in December of 1968 on Apollo 8. But again, the LM was still not quite ready. And so Apollo 8's mission was changed to orbit the moon, and so this was shunted to Apollo 9, where in March of 1969, the first manned LM test flew. This was known as LM-3. LM-1 was the first unmanned test. LM-2 never flew. That went smooth enough. So next, we had the so-called dress rehearsal of Apollo 10, in which LM-4 got as close as 47,000 feet to the lunar surface, but did not land. That was in May of '69. And then, of course, LM-5 landed on the moon in July of 1969 with Apollo 11. So what was so complicated about this? What do we have on this craft? Well, essentially it's a 2-in-1. It's 2 craft. This would be carried behind the Apollo module in the Saturn V stack. And once in trajectory to the moon, the module would flip over and grab this out of its little cradle, dock to it, and things would start deploying. With the legs in, it's about 13 feet, but when the legs are fully out, it's about 31 feet. You know, volume for the upper section doesn't seem so bad at first, at about 235 square feet, but actual habitable volume is only 160 square feet, and this is for 2 men with bulky spacesuits and the gear to live. To put that into perspective, it's under 8 foot tall in the cabin and only about 3.5 foot wide. Yeah, and they slept in hammocks and ate, I'm sure, delicious meals. The legs, of course, would fold out from the lower base. There would be storage for gear in little trays down here. We have several communications equipment. One change they made around 65. Originally it was going to use fuel cells like the module. Later this became an all battery powered craft for a few different reasons. Essentially, this is a 2-stage itself. The descent stage is what you see here. It has an engine on the bottom to come down. It has about, or at least originally with Apollo 11, it had about 2 minutes hover time to find its landing spot between the boulders. Later this would be increased on subsequent missions to give a little bit more hover, but originally that's what they had. Once down, they would check all their systems, get prepared, and then the commander would egress. And then once he was safely on the surface, the pilot would follow about 20-30 minutes later. Essentially, the commander was the pilot. In reality, he handled the thrust and the steering. The pilot was more of really the navigator, and he kind of did everything else. He monitored systems and did all that good stuff. Once on the surface, they would go to the trays, pull stuff out. Now I'm talking the original the H-class missions, which would be Apollo 11, 12, and 14, and also the planned 13 that never landed. The maximum duration they could stay on the surface with the perishables and supplies was 48 hours, or 2 days. They would conduct whatever scientific studies they could. They had cameras, basic geology gear, and then when they were ready to take off, the upper stage would separate. The lower would be left behind on lunar surface. Its engine was no longer needed, and it would also kind of act as a stable launching platform. And so the ascent stage would go up. It has its own engine system to return to lunar orbit with its 2-man crew, and then docking would be the responsibility of the orbiting command module. The lunar module really didn't have much to say about that at this point. So you see there's actually 2 sets of engines and all that entails, not to mention all the communications equipment and food, water, oxygen, of course. The original H missions would continue in 69 and 70, and then in 1971, in July, Apollo 15 would fly as the first J-class mission with the ELM, or Extended lunar module. Originally, 15 was to be another H mission, but because the program was planned to be cut back, they bumped it ahead. And the extended missions are exactly what you'd expect. The module itself could carry more, and it could spend more time on lunar surface, up to 75 hours, so just a bit over 3 days versus we're at 2. This is also when the lunar rover, the little cart, appears. It was stored down below in this landing pad section, the descent. So they could go further. They had more time and they had an ability to go further using the little wannabe golf cart. When they were down on the surface, there was enough lift capability to bring about 230 pounds worth of rocks, plus film and other things back up to orbit. And then again, as before, they would rendezvous with the command module. And once everything had been taken off, the ascent module, these would be jettisoned, no longer needed. Early on, they would just kind of jettison these out, but very quickly they would start jettisoning them intentionally to crash into the moon's surface. So none of this would make the return trip to Earth. And in fact, of the command module, this whole back service section would be jettisoned once it was no longer needed. And so the only thing that would return from that giant Saturn V is this little cone at the top, containing our 3 intrepid souls who went to the moon, and 2 of them walked around on it. Well, unless, of course, you're talking Apollo 13. But yeah, that is kind of what happened. The last mission was Apollo 17 in December of 1972. Once it left the surface, the last LM was used. The last men walked on the moon, at least to date, 50 years later. And the aims of the space program have radically changed. A total of 15 LMs were built. 10 of them were used. None of them failed. Has a very good success rate. As complicated of a piece of equipment as it was, them taking their time and using it was smart because it ended up being a very reliable piece of equipment. Again, much to the happiness of Apollo 13. They were planning to do more LMs. In fact, they were under construction for Apollos 18 and 19 and beyond, but some were either completed and then put on display, others were just scrapped, and none have been made ever since. But it's a really interesting challenge to land and then leave the moon if you think about it. So I thought, why not do a video on it? But yeah, these are neat little models for well under 20 bucks just to have. Very metal feeling on the lander here. The base is plastic polymer, but then the upper is pretty much all metal except for the antenna. And like I said, the same on the Apollo capsule. It's pretty much all metal. Even the nozzle in the back is metal. Only the little antenna and the drogue in the front are plastic polymer. Well, if you'd like to talk about NASA stuff, I always enjoy that below in the comments. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. I really appreciate you tuning in. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.